All right, everyone, we're back and we're going to test the API that we just built. So right now we have full CRUD functionality, but the big problem is the way that we've been conducting any kind of testing until now is through manual testing. And there is nothing wrong with testing things manually, but there is a problem with only testing things manually. So I think I can speak for a lot of developers when I say that the way we assess whether or not our features work is we go in here and we just click execute, and then we look at the response, and then we say, is this what I expect? And then we go into the front end, and then we click the button, and then we're like, is this what I want? Yes, no. But this is, of course, not sufficient for any kind of professional developer. So what we're going to do is we're going to start getting a little more serious with testing now. Okay, so if you don't have the source code and you want to test the same API as I have right here, what you can do is you can just clone it. So first of all, we'll just take a look at the exact same API that was finished last time. So git clone https github.com/oldalex/programming2 video 2. Once you have this code, go into programming 2 video 2. And of course, we're going to execute the API using .NET run command. We don't need to open up the IDE or anything like that. As soon as this one is running, we're capable of having the Swagger page open. And now it's running again. If you have the source code, you should also have this by now. And you should be able to go in here and execute. And as long as you can connect to your database with your environment variable, you should also be able to get some response back. Your data will probably be different, but you should get some kind of response back. So the tool that I will be introducing it to is called Postman. And Postman is an HTTP client, just like the browser is an HTTP client, just like curl is an HTTP client. This is a program capable of requesting our API. That's kind of it, but it has a little more stuff built into it that allows it for being a good testing tool. So if you just go to postman.com/downloads, you should get to this page. There is also possibility to install it using various different package managers. You just pick whatever installation that you like. It should be able to detect your operating system in here and just follow the installation instructions. And by the way, there is also a web version where you just run it inside of a browser. I don't recommend using that one. Anyways, when you just boot up the program, it should look something like this. And the page that you're probably going to get to should look like this. You don't have to make an account. You can just click this one right here, skip and go to the app, and you don't have to be signed in or anything. When you start out, the first thing that we're interested in doing is just sending a basic HTTP request with Postman. Click new, click HTTP request. There's a bunch of stuff in here that we're never going to use, and you get this here. Let's just minimize that for now. The basic functionality of the HTTP client is that you enter some address, localhost 5000, API, books, click send, and then you get data back. So very familiar, right? But what makes this a great tool is that it allows for automation. It allows for having a lot of canned requests ready for you. It allows for analyzing the request much better. So what we're going to start out by doing is create what we call a collection. So if you click this create collection, you can also go to file and click new and click collection here. Doesn't matter. Give this a name that is descriptive of what it is. So right now we have a collection called library. So we can take this request we just made, click save, and this click the library here, and then just give it a name like git/API/books. And right now we're hard coding the request URL here. So it's not a good thing to do, because what if you want to serve this somewhere else, and what if you want to deploy this and it's not going to say port 5000 or whatever. So the first thing we're going to start out by doing is just click the library tab here, then go to variables. And then you could have many different requests inside one collection. That's the concept of a collection. It's a collection of requests, right? And then you just add a variable here. I'm going to call this base URL. And I'm going to write HTTP localhost for 5,000. And I'm going to add /API. So once we go into the requests here, we just delete this. And now we can add the base URL here. So if you write base URL inside of curly brackets like this, be sure to save. So if you click on this little floppy disk here, it's going to save. And now we will have this base URL here, which points to localhost port 5000 /API. And now we don't need to add API ourselves. And just test that it works. We're successfully getting the same response here. Okay, so I'll just briefly explain some of the tools that are in here before I get to all of the testing stuff. Because right now we're just interested in sending some requests. So we want to figure out how can we send requests. So let's say that you want to add some parameters to your request here. So books could of course have something called search term. So if you add something here, search term, and have some value like a ABC, you can see that your URL here changes. So of course you will notice that this looks very familiar. So let's say that you're on YouTube and you go to a video, it's gonna say something like the question mark, and then it's gonna say watch, and then it's gonna have like some long code that identifies a video. Like that is a search parameter. That's just because the client says, hey, I want to search for some parameter key with this value here. So you can just remove it again. We don't really need this. And you can add multiple of these. The auth tab mostly just sets a header for you. So all HTTP requests, they have headers. So you click this one that says hidden, then you can see all of the hidden headers here. So you can see something about where is the request coming from and yada, yada, yada. And you can put in data here manually. So this is, of course, different from setting data in the body that we're typically doing. And I'm just going to demonstrate what happens if we put some data into the auth tab here. So let's say I add a bearer token with some stuff here. This is a little piece of data that would signify the requester's identity. Then we go into the headers here. And now we can see that the authorization header here now has a token that says bearer and then this value we put in here. We also don't need that for now. Then, of course, there is the body, and mostly you're going to use the one called raw and then click JSON. So you're going to do that little sequence, picking raw, picking JSON like a gazillion times if you want to build these requests manually. And of course, you just start out by making curly brackets, and then you say whatever key has whatever value here. Of course, JSON could also be an array. So you can have an array here, and then there is an object here with a key and a value. So this is, of course, not different from what we've been seeing inside of Swagger or the browser or whatever. Then there is this tab here. This is very interesting. This is something you would primarily use when you're doing testing, and this stands for pre-request script. So the way that these scripts work is that you write some JavaScript code in here, and then this JavaScript code executes using a runtime that is based on something called Node.js. So Node.js is essentially taking the engine of a browser and then running it outside of a browser. And then Postman is like, we can use this for writing some scripts. So let's say you want to set up some things before you send a request. Let's say that in order to get these books, you want to make sure that there are some books inside of the database. So you could have a script here that sends some books to the database and then have a test here inside of the test tab, evaluate whether or not you're getting some books back. So in the testing terminology, we would say that the prerequisite is the arrangement the sending of the request is the act, and the test tab here is the assertions. So when we test, what we do is we make assertions about a program. So I might assert that when I click this button here and send the request, that I get a status code 200 back. So we can express that as a test inside of the test tab. I'm not going to cover how to write the tests because the tests, they are written in JavaScript and we have not been covering JavaScript yet. I'm just going to demonstrate the tests using the snippets they have out here because the snippets, they are very, very good starting point for just making some basic tests and automating these. Because if you know what status codes are, status codes, they indicate a whole lot of things about the request's response. So this right here is a perfectly valid test. So later on, when we haven't covered JavaScript, we'll get back in here and start writing some more nuanced tests. But the status codes here, they are a very good starting point. And if you want to do more than that, you should just check out these other snippets here. So let's say that you have a request inside of your collection here that you know is going to be a 400 status code bad request, like this one. I know this one is going to return 400 because we don't allow publishers with just the name string. There are certain publishers like publisher 1 and publisher 2 that we allow. So I assert that this, or I expect that this status code is supposed to be 400. So when we run this request, we get the test result passing. So remember, a test is not successful just because the status code is a positive status code. The test passes if our expectation, like what we assert about the outcome, is equal to the actual outcome. So that's the idea of testing. Is my expectation of what the system does the same as what the system does? So I'm back in the browser here, and I'm just going to open up the Swagger page here. And I'm going to show you something that I think is super cool. When you have these HTTP requests here in Swagger, they always give you the curl request here. And Postman understands what a curl request is. So you can import all of these requests from Swagger, so you don't have to write all of the requests manually every single time. So the request that I have right here is deterministically the same as if I just put this here inside of curl and send that. So right now I get this response back here. Of course, curl doesn't show a lot of detail. If we go in here and we start sending it, we can see a little more detail because we have the console tab here that goes into great detail of what's going on. And of course, we can go analyze all of the headers and whatnot. But just to speed up your process, I know that a lot of people, they don't prioritize testing because they think it's too time consuming. If you just take all of your requests from Swagger and just import them as curl commands here, what you can also do, let's say that you already have a front end that is running. Then inside of the front end, when you start to use these features here, let's execute this one here. You can always just take the requests here, right-click it, click copy as curl. Once you copy it as curl, like there's a bunch of different ways you can copy it. Just use this curl command here. Then you can also take that one, go into import here, go into raw text and paste it. And you could do that for any requests from your browser. So let's say that you want to test something that you didn't build yourself, like you don't have to test something that you're the maker of. Let's say that you want to test this request to get to google.com, and you just copy this one as curl, and you go in here and import and click raw text, paste this one, continue, import, and now you can start writing a test about your requests to google.com. Of course, that would be like a weird thing to do. So here you, of course, just have all of the HTML response from going to google.com. You can click preview, and then you have well, you have Google here inside of Postman. So if you just want to get started with using Postman and you don't even have an API to test, you can just find someone else's and just start fooling around with Postman and writing some assertions about what's going on when you start sending these requests. Anyways, let's just get back to testing our own API now. So I'm going to call this one post books and put it into the same collection. And we can also take this one and also save it. Post books also. So now we have two different requests inside of Postman here. And why would we have that? Well, we have it because let's say that you have your data annotation set up inside of your API and you want to figure out if the data annotation does what you think it's supposed to do. Well, instead of going into Swagger and always manually modifying the request body and then sending the request over again, and then next time you modify it, you have to build that request again, you can just have a request ready here. And of course, naturally, when you have a request ready that you have some expectations for, you would write a test script for it. So you could have, for each given endpoint, you can have many different tests. And maybe you could have a test that fails because there isn't a cover image URL, and all of these different conditions that could make a test fail or pass. Just have them lined up in here. And then once you start making changes to the application, you go in and then you just execute them all. So you can click save here and just go into the collection. And then you just click this one and click run. So now we can run all of the requests, and it will also run all of the tests for all the requests. And now we're starting to get somewhere. Because if you can have, let's say, 10 different requests for each endpoint, they have different inputs and they have different outcomes. And we can test that all of these outcomes are exactly what we expect the system to do. Then we can have a lot of confidence that our application is working. So you might think, isn't it redundant to write a test like this? Like, we already know that this is working. We already tested it. Well, I think I can speak for a lot of developers when I say sometimes when you are programming, you accidentally break things that you don't intend on breaking. So what you do is, like, you're inside of your application here. So right now we have a stack trace up because we sent a request that was not approved. So let's say that we change something. We go into the transfer models here. So let's modify the create book request ECO. And you just hired a new junior developer, and the junior developer is like, oh, we don't use this, right? I think this is just some old code. I'm going to delete this one. Or like maybe, I don't know, their cat is walking on the keyboard when they're programming. And then they're like, yeah, I'm going to save this one. And of course, they are reckless. So they just take this and they commit it to Git without running any tests or anything. And now once you're starting the program again, and there's feel like a modification, and then all of a sudden something doesn't work. Like, how do you find out that the validator doesn't work anymore? Like, either you go through all of the different possibilities of things that you want to be accepted and not accepted by the validator. That requires you to go into Swagger or into your front end and manually going through all of these different things. That's a huge waste of time. So what you do is you, of course, just have all of these different requests lined up. You go into your collection here and you just run all of them. So every time you make a change and you want to commit your changes, the idea is that you test, do all of the features still work? What if I do it 1,000 times? Do they still work? That's the kind of mentality we want to have when we test. We want to be really thorough. So all of the different edge cases, like what if I put in a string that is 1,000 characters long as the book title? What if I don't put it in a book title? What if I put Japanese characters in as a book title? You want to test all of the different conceivable outcomes by just duplicating these, changing the data inside of the duplicate. So you go in here and then you make some other data and then you make a test assertion about that. And then every single time you make a change, you know instantly. But of course, this depends on, first of all, you need to actually write the tests. So it takes a little bit of time, even if you import them from Swagger using this curl command. It's still going to take a little bit of time to modify all of the request bodies and figuring out, okay, do I expect this to fail because of the 400 error or whatever? So there is a little time investment here. And what you should also be doing is automating the running of all of the tests inside of your collection here. So there is luckily tools for that. If you ever speak to any professional developer, one thing they can never shut up about is their pipelines. So when they commit their code, they will have basically a long recipe of things that will happen every single time. So one of them is taking all of the source code, building the program from that source code on some server, and installing all of the relevant dependencies and whatnot, and then taking all of the tests. So tests like these that we write in here, right? It's going to be executed inside of that environment, and then we can figure out, does it also work on other machines than just my own machine? Because of course it doesn't matter if it works on your machine, if it doesn't work wherever you're going to deploy it to. Every single time you make changes in your code base, assess whether or not those changes is going to mess up anything. Especially if you're working in a team, because at some point, someone's going to commit something that is going to break some feature. So it is better to have them run the tests when they make commits locally before they push those changes to the remote repository than have them push the changes to the remote repository and then someone posts the changes and then the system ends up breaking. And now how do we make this pipeline? So one tool that exists for making pipelines is called Github Actions. And luckily, if we also use GitHub for our hosting for version control, it is very easy to set up GitHub Actions. But how do we actually execute all of these tests on some server? Because right now we have downloaded a program here and we just click a button. But clicking a button, that's generally not how we automate things. We need the commands for it. And luckily there exists a tool called Newman, which is a command line interface for executing Postman collections. So this collection right here, I want to be able to take this collection and just keep this as a markup, and then the command line interface tool will be responsible for sending all of the requests and running all of the tests. So what I do is I click here, export, and then you click collection. So there are different versions of the collection, just pick 2.1, and then you can keep it somewhere. So I'm gonna just put it inside of my downloads and just call it whatever you want here. It's just a JSON file. So save the collection as a JSON file. Now, if we open up a terminal here, so we can just use this one, we can see that we have the collection.json file here. And now we can execute all of the requests inside of this collection. So basically it starts sending out all of the HTTP requests, running all of the pre-request scripts. They're going through all of the assertions inside of the testing tab. And of course, it uses all of the data from the Postman collection. So the base URL we specified, localhost port 5000/API, is still in here. Basically, all of the data that we have in here is now just available as JSON format. If we take the contents here and just write it out, this is what it looks like. This is basically just what we've been writing. It takes all of the headers, all of everything, and just putting it here. So the tool that we will be using, like I mentioned, is called Newman. You don't have it if you haven't installed it already. And in order to install Newman, you need to have Node.js. And when you install Node.js, you also get a program called the Node Package Manager. So on this side here, nodejs.org, you can download it. However, I recommend that you install Node.js using the Node Version Manager. So there is a Windows version here. You go into Corey Butler nvm -windows on GitHub. So you can always just Google search GitHub Node version manager, and you need this one here if you're on a Windows machine. If you are on Linux or Mac, you go to the original repository in here, and I'm gonna just demonstrate how you use Node version manager. I'm not gonna go through the installation. They have described the installation here for you. So the usage of the Node version manager is writing nvm, and then you get a list of the things you can do. So if you want to use a specific version of Node, right now I have Node version 16 installed. Let's say that I want to write nvm install 18. It's going to get the newest version of Node.js 18. So Node.js is a runtime for JavaScript. So like I mentioned previously, you can execute JavaScript programs outside of the browser because Newman is a JavaScript program. So now I use Node.js version 18. If I want to use 16, I just write nvm use 16. If I want to go back to 18, I just write nvm use 18. So super simple. Anyways, if you have the Node.js installed on your machine, you write node and then -v, and you get some version. What you do is you write npm, stands for Node Package Manager. So it is different from the version manager. This is the package manager. And then you write I for install. You can also just write install. And then you write -g for global. And then you write Newman. So Newman is the command line interface tool that we will be using for executing the scripts. If you want to learn about what Newman is, I'll just show you their registry page. It is right in here. So if you're ever curious about any package on the Node Package Manager, you can just go in here. And by the way, you will be needing Node.js and the Node Package Manager anyways during this course, because once we're done testing the API, we will be making a front end for the API. And that requires Node.js and npm installation. So you will need to do this anyway. So if you've installed Newman and you write Newman, you should be able to get this response here. And there's not a whole lot of things in here. There is the command run, and then you can add some options, and then you can just point to some collection in JSON format. So I just write Newman, run, and you could specify that you want to run something inside of the current folder by doing this and then writing the name of the JSON. I think you can just add the name straight away, and now it's going to execute it. So it's doing all of these requests, and there are some executions here, and we don't have any failed assertions or whatever. And of course, we only have one assertion because the only test that we did was is the status code of the getbooks 200, and it is. What if you have a collection and you want the collection inside of here? Well, that's very easy because you just write import, and then you click upload files, and then you just click on this library.json. So you can import it from a JSON and export it to a JSON. So right here, we just have a true copy of this one up here, which means that when you make a new feature, you probably want to just make a new collection and then take this new collection and then export it as a JSON. And inside of your working directory, just have a folder called API tests, where you're just exporting all of these API tests to. Okay, so now we're going to make this pipeline. And like I mentioned, we're going to use something called Github Actions. And Github Actions call their pipelines workflows. So the easiest way to get started is just to make an empty directory and call this one .github. Don't forget the dot. And keep in mind, this is completely different from the .git folder. The .git folder has all of the data about our version control for all your Git commits and yada, yada, yada. And of course, Git is separate from GitHub. GitHub is just a hosting service for version control. And nowadays, they do a lot of other things because since Microsoft started acquiring them, they've been doing a bunch of other things. But anyways, inside of this .github folder, you add something called workflows. And now we're going to create our first workflow. So the workflows should be specified in something called YAML. You will see extensions like this. This is the 3-character extension. You will also sometimes see a 4-character extension like this. It stands for yet another markup language. So of course, this is just a file with some markup. And then this markup file just explains the workflow. So it's just a procedure of things that must be done and when they should be done. So I'm gonna call this one API test.yaml. And you can just say, yeah, commit this one to Git. Notice that there are no curly brackets on the outside of anything. YAML is very, very clean looking because it's indentation based. So just like if you write a Python code and you notice that there aren't as many characters all over the place, that is because the space or the indentation is what governs how the format is. So we can start off here by just writing name, API tests with Postman, executed using newman CLI. So that's a super long name. And we're going to add something here called on, the name of the GitHub event that triggers the workflow. We don't have to write anything here. We can just go a line down and write a push. And now you will just specify what kind of branches that when we push to, these tests will trigger. So right now I just have a branch called main. Of course, you should probably have different branches depending on your branching strategy. It is also completely legit to do trunk-based development. Don't let anyone tell you that trunk-based development is not legit. There are good and there are bad ways of doing trunk-based development, but it is a strategy. And we could also say that it should run on pull requests. And here we will still specify branches. So I'm going to say branch, and here I'm just going to add a little asterisk here. So this means on all pull requests and on pushes to main branch, the following jobs will be run. So we can see here that a workflow run is made up of one or more jobs. So I'm going to add a building process. So before we can actually execute all the tests, it requires that we have the program running, because first of all, we run the program. Once the program is running, we can then start the newman CLI to test by sending all these requests to the API. So there are different sequences in order for setting up the building and the execution. So I'll just write the rest of the pipeline, and then I'll come back to you and then I'll explain the pipeline. And with very, very high certainty, your pipeline for just doing API testing is going to look a lot like this one. I wouldn't call it boilerplate code, because this is not just something that has to be there. You can specify a lot of things to your preferences. But I reckon that yours is going to be very similar to mine. Okay, and because we're going to execute all of these things on the server, that means that your local environment variable for accessing your database is of course not possible to use, because the server doesn't know about your environment variables. So what you're going to do is you're going to go into your repository here on GitHub, go to settings, scroll down and pick this one called actions that is under secrets and variables. And now we're going to add a repository secret. So I called my connection string PGCONN. So you're going to get your connection string for Elephant SQL. I just put it here, or whatever database that you're using for your project. So I'm going to paste mine in here. All right. And when you paste your variable here, you will see that it is uppercase. So I just finished the pipeline. And the first thing I'm going to show you is how you insert the environment variable in your pipeline. So here I have the finished pipeline. And down here, there's something called ENV, stands for environment. you can use lowercase for the key of the environment variable, because that is what your program is referencing when it is writing environments get environment variable yada 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 inside of your C# code. But this here has to be uppercase, because this one is referencing the variable that you have stored on GitHub. So this is the exact syntax you should be using. If you're just using a normal GitHub account that isn't something you're paying for, so the normal free tier, it's still very generous and you do get a lot of execution minutes. But the way that it works is that you have the finite amount of minutes that you can execute GitHub Actions for on a free plan. It's a lot of minutes, so you're probably never going to hit that ceiling as a normal student. But just know that there is a ceiling. And on github.com, they have the ceiling here. So GitHub Free has 200 minutes per month of execution time. So that's, of course, many hours of execution. And you should take note of this down here. This is the minute multipliers. So if you choose to run the server with Mac OS, I'm not talking about your machine being a Mac machine, but if you're running it on the data center with a Mac operating system, it will have a minute multiplier of 10. So you have 200 minutes instead of 2,000 minutes. If you run Windows, it's only a minute multiplier by 2, which means that you basically have half the amount of minutes. And if you use Linux, that is the cheapest one. And of course, I would always defer to using Linux. And I have some scripts down here. Some of these, they will not work on a Windows machine. So if you run something that is not on Linux, then you have to find your own scripts for this. But you basically don't have any reason not to pick Linux for running this on the server, because it is the far cheapest, and almost all help and documentation you will find for setting things up in pipelines, they will default to using the Linux commands. I guess there are also help for other operating systems, but you know, if you can use any operating system, you might as well use the cheapest and also the best one. So we're using the latest version of Ubuntu. And since we're running a .NET application, we need to use this actions setup.net. So we can specify the exact version of .NET that we want to use, and we want to use .NET version 8. And then we can also set up Node.js at the same time. So here they also supply a version of Node.js for us, and I just picked version 18 because it's the one that I'm running locally as well. And then I use this command here for installing newman. So this is basically the same thing as we did locally here on our own machines when we were just executing the tests with this command line interface tool. And now we're just doing it on the server. Now here is where it actually gets interesting. So I made a little directory called shell scripts that has one called run all API tests. So it just looks through every single JSON file that I have inside the directory called tests/API. So if you remember the Postman collections, they were in a JSON format. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this collection here, and if you haven't exported already, just export it as a JSON here. So for me, I have the directory here, and I put in another directory called test and another directory inside of that called API. So just save this. And now inside of API, we have this beautiful JSON file here with all of our tests. So the pipeline goes into our shell scripts directory. So change directory to shell scripts. And now we have this script called wait for it. So the reason why we use this wait for it is because we need to set up the program to run. And while the program is running, we need to send all of the requests. And then we need to shut down the program again. And if it does run indefinitely, you will use up all of your resources. But I will leave all this source code up because you can just copy my shell scripts here, and you can just make a directory called test with a directory called API inside of it, and you can use this exact same setup as long as you're running it on Ubuntu on the server. So this is all copy friendly. You just need to supply your own environment variable, so don't worry about it. And also, if you're not running on localhost port 5000, you should either modify that or modify this address right here. So the program will execute completely normally with the .NET run command. So here you will just find what we call the process ID of the execution. And now we're saying, wait until the program is occupying this port here, and then run all of the tests, which means that you can add several collections in here. You can have as many collections in here, and it'll just run all of them. So once that you've been running all of the connections, then it will kill the process, which means it shuts down the API again. So you're not taking excess resources on the server. And so I just put the collection.json file in here. If we just commit this and push it to GitHub, and we go onto our GitHub repository here, we should be able to see that right now there is some GitHub action in execution. It is in the process of building right now. You can click on this, and then you can see how far it is. And we're getting somewhere. And now it's green, which means it's done and it's passed. So there is all of the different commands here. And we can see here it is executing all of the tests, just like if we did when we were running all of the tests locally with the command line interface. So of course, we only have 2 assertions. So that's not a whole lot. But anyways, every single time you start committing new code, just make tests for your features with Postman, export it as a JSON, put it inside of your API test directory. And then once you make commits, all of the tests will be executed. So you can always figure out, are my tests failing or are they passing or whatever is going on? So let's say that you had a test fail for some reason. Let's go and modify the code real quick. So I'll just modify the GET request because I know that we have a successful GET request. So let's just go HTTP context response status code and make it a 314. That's always the best status code to use if you don't know what to use. And now we can see that the build here has some failed assertions. And now we can see that we're getting a bad build here. So there is something wrong. And the thing that is wrong is an assertion that is failing. And it is failing because the status code that we expect at 200 is not at 200. It's a 314. So this way, every single time you make commits to your code base, you can always go in and figure out, is everything still working? And right now, we don't have a big application, so it doesn't feel super valuable. But once you're starting to get a really big code base, this is something that will save your life. So of course, we're just scratching the surface of what we can do with pipelines here and what we can do with API testing in general. And we're only just getting started with Postman. And we haven't even talked about how to do scripting in Postman. We're just using some status code checks here. And so this is really just an introduction to how to test and how to automate tests. Most developers, when they start out testing, they only do unit testing. And unit testing have a lot of constraints. First of all, they aim to isolate small pieces of code. But in order to figure out, do your features still work? Then we have to assess how all of the different components work together. And that's why an API test is so powerful. It tests all the layers from your API all the way down to your persistence and back again without using any mocking or stopping. At some point in the future, things like automated testing and running API tests on your commits, they will help you. And they will probably save your life at some point in time, and they will help you sleep at night. So you should really adopt some of these practices in your testing.